It's 6:32, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this evening. My name is Greer Luce. I am the Curator of Education and Public Programs at Morven, and I'm going to welcome you to the webinar, and then I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker tonight. So thank you so much for joining us for Clockwatching in 19th Century America, a national pastime, an amazing title for a talk, if I do say so myself. This program is brought to you as part of Morven's current exhibition, Striking Beauty, New Jersey Tall Case Clocks, 1730 to 1830. The exhibit, the first of its kind, features over 50 examples of tall case clocks made in New Jersey. As you walk through the galleries of the exhibit, the introductory text starts by placing these beautiful decorative pieces in their practical context, timekeeping. How did clocks and clock time come to assume such an important role in American life? This evening, we have an amazing speaker here to address this question and more. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I did want to mention that we will have time for audience Q&A at the conclusion of the talk, and you can add your questions to the Q&A box throughout the talk, and we'll address that at the end. It's now my pleasure to introduce Professor McCrossen. After receiving her PhD in the history of American civilization from Harvard University in 1995, Alexis McCrossen joined the faculty of Southern Methodist University, where she is currently a professor of history. Her publications include Holy Day, Holiday, The American Sunday, and Marking Modern Times, Clocks, Watches, and Other Timekeepers in American Life. She is now finishing a book about the history of New Year's observances. Sounds fascinating. So now I will pass things off to Professor McCrossen.
Hello, good evening. Hello from Dallas. I'm happy to be here. I wish I was there. It sounds like the Morven Museum is a terrific place, and I'll look forward to visiting it sometime in the near future. Thank you so much for tuning into Zoom tonight. And I've changed the title of my talk slightly, The Enigma of Clocks in a Nation of Clock Watchers. And I'll be focusing on talking about the uncertainty that clocks actually introduced and the ways that Americans responded to that and their quest for increasing certainty. So with that being said, these two remarkable photographs brought me up short the first time I saw them. How did they fit into a story of progressive improvements in timekeeping? For years, they hovered on the edge of my working mind as I plowed through material about timekeeping in the US. I included them in my book, Marking Modern Times, although I didn't discuss them at much length. A few years ago, I realized that they emblematize an important and hitherto unacknowledged aspect of timekeeping during the long 19th century. These photos remind us that clocks did not always work. What is more, even when not working, clocks elicited fascination. The men in the cart on the San Francisco street are perhaps discussing the best way to disassemble the clock. The boys and men on the Milwaukee thoroughfare pose for a newspaper photographer, a bit stunned by the busted dial and exposed clockworks. The destructive force of Mother Nature in one case and of a raging progressive politician in another brought these 15 or 20-foot high street clocks low. Here we see another Milwaukee street clock destroyed in the same raid as the one we just saw in the previous slide. Here, the boys and young men dare to stand on its smashed face. They look at the photographer tentatively. I've always wondered what was going through their minds. So I use this as a kind of grabber, as a way to open up this talk. Back to the chart. Over the course of the 19th century, the variety and extent of timekeepers in the United States increased so dramatically that it could be said that clock watching became a national pastime. Nevertheless, few Americans entirely trusted or relied upon mechanical time. Until the 1880s, there was no agreed upon time standard with which to set clocks or ring bells. What is more, many timekeeping mechanisms ran poorly and they broke, while some were destroyed in accidents or, as we've just seen, on purpose. Regardless of the time they conveyed, then, clocks and watches were enigmatic. They disseminated variable, shifting, and unstable measures of time. Even after a national time standard was implemented in 1883, uncertainty about the time persisted. In part, this was due to the faulty operations of clocks and watches. Uncertainty also persisted despite the innovations and regulation and synchronization of clocks that was made possible first by the telegraph, introduced in 1844, and then later by electricity and wireless communications. While we might be inclined to interpret the increase in the variety and the extent of timekeepers over the course of the 19th century as a victory for certainty, people would finally know what time it was, the opposite was the case. In this context, then, clock watching was about more than ascertaining the time or checking clocks for precision or accuracy. It was an exercise in which the uncertainty and instability of clock time was acknowledged, negotiated, and also, of course, at times regretted. Now, clock watching is a term that was coined by the historian Michael Salter in a wonderful American Historical Review essay, and I give you the citation here at the bottom of the slide. And this term, clock watching, is a very useful concept. Sauter describes in his essay how residents of 18th century Berlin closely scrutinized their town clock, assessing its accuracy and its precision. With confidence in their clocks, clock found on the Domkirche and another one found at the Academy. So with confidence in their clocks, Berliners and then other communities implemented tight and complex schedules for everything from labor forces to railroad lines. Altogether, the result was an increased tempo of everyday life. Clock watching took two guises, both utilitarian. In the first instance, watching clocks meant checking their accuracy. In the second instance, watching clocks provided a point of reference with which to organize daily life. The first type of clock watching was a precursor to modernity. The second, the epitome of the modern condition. Once clocks were hegemonic reference point for temporal organization, modern time discipline had arrived. Now, tonight, what I'd like to do is to introduce you to the history of American timekeeping by deepening and enlarging on Sauter's insight about clock watching. So rather than focus on the clocks that worked, I will focus on broken ones. I wish to suggest that their faulty operations and the absence of an agreed upon time standard, along with the difficulties associated with synchronizing clocks, did not stand in the way of modernity, even when they stood in the way of keeping time and living by the clock. So instead, what I think these clocks did is they fostered a structure of feeling, uncertainty, that is at the heart of modernity. So this is a bit of a contrary conceit, and we'll see how it goes. So let me start here with a few of the clocks that are in the exhibit on the second floor of the Morven house. And these are terrific examples of tall case clocks with intricate clock works, clock mechanisms. The cabinetry would have been built by a local carpenter, and the clockworks in the case of this exhibit were also made in Connecticut and New Jersey, and I think there's one or two from New York State. So since the 18th century, when demand for tall case clocks like these If not before, some transatlantic figures and institutions sought to control uncertainty. Commercial, crop, and life insurers, probability statisticians, and weather forecasters are but a few examples of figures seeking to control uncertainty. There were new practices, there were new networks, and there were new technologies that were introduced to mitigate risk, to manage uncertainty, and to coordinate large systems. This was as much the case with timekeeping as with international trade, commercial agriculture, and national banking. But as a denser and denser network developed, meant to convey the time, uncertainties about it accumulated. The fact that clock time itself was enigmatic, that is, that its origins for many were mysterious and difficult to understand, and the operation of clocks was puzzling, only added to the degree of uncertainty. The enigma of clocks, not simply their authority, fostered a modern sensibility. There is no doubt that the quest for accuracy and precision beget conditions in which modernity flourished, but so too did the babble of times emanating from faulty clocks, from indeterminate and multiple time standards, and from unreliable communication technologies. What I'm saying here is that for every clock that there was, for every watch, for every set of church bells, there was a different time, and Americans were quite aware of that. It wasn't until after the turn of the 20th century that technological, cultural, and social components coalesced enough for clock time to attain the status of incontestable. Today, tonight, I want to sketch out a few instances of temporal uncertainty drawn from a 19th century American fact and fiction. So let's start here in Philadelphia. And let's start by considering the account found in George Lippard's sensational 1845 novel, The Quaker City. And he describes one of his main characters stopping in front of the State House clock, which you actually see here. Well, you see the Independence Hall, and a State House clock had been erected, as you see up on the tower. So he halted for a few moments in order to ascertain the difference in time between his gold repeater and the State House clock. A gold repeater is a watch, a kind of watch, which had just struck one. The State House clock had just struck one. While thus engaged, intently perusing the face of his watch by the light of the moon, a stout middle-aged gentleman wrapped up in a thick overcoat with a carpet bag in his hand came striding rapidly across the street, and for a moment stood silent and unperceived at his shoulder. And then he said, "Well, Luke, is the repeater right and the State House wrong?" in a hearty and cheerful voice. So here we see in this passage a question about the authority for the time. Was the authority for the time Luke's pocket watch or the State House clock? Was it the bell striking one, or was it the moon? Lippard's passage provides no clue as to which is more reliable, but it is a foregone conclusion that none of these timekeepers will agree. Indeed, every timekeeper seemed to show its own time. There was little possibility of synchronicity, not between oral and visual time indicators, not between natural and mechanical ones, not even between a pocket watch and the State House clock. One scholar has described this scene from the Quaker City as, quote, a decidedly urban moment that speaks to the anxieties of a nation that had come to regard its cities as so many undecipherable texts, full of shifting and misleading signs. Clocks were among the most visible of these enigmatic texts. They were found in public spaces, among signs, among handbills, posters, parade banners, newspapers, and currency, all of which constituted what the historian David Henkin calls the core of urban modernity in the capitalist West. But with only a few timekeepers deserving the commendation of precision, and with accurate time mostly out of reach, responses to these timekeepers, especially in the middle decades of the 19th century, included suspicion and mockery, and also cunning and acceptance. So while this point will become a bit clearer as in this my next discussion here, which is about Edgar Allan Poe's The Devil in the Belfry, a short story from 1838. Now, even a town clock with 7 large faces that was readily seen from all quarters, as Poe put it, could not quell the uncertainty of the townsmen of Wonder what time it is, wonderfully spelled out by Poe as Wonder what time it is. So the town of Wonder what time it is. The clock, quote, was never yet known to have anything the matter with it. Indeed, the bare supposition of such a thing was considered heretical. All the town's clocks, watches, and bells were precise and accurate. A synchronized town was preposterous enough for a Gothic tale. A synchronized town in Poe's rendering of the horror, in his rendering of this horror of a synchronized town, he has a dandified man deranged Wonder what time it is, perfect setup, by ringing 13 hours on the town bell. And you see this deranged figure here in the illustration from The Devil in the Belfry. Pandemonium was unleashed when those 13 hours were rung. And not only in Poe's tale as a whole, but across America, synchronicity was chimerical. It was Gothic, it was fantastical. So moving from fiction to fact, consider New York City in the 1850s. During that decade, the chronic incongruity among the city's great clocks, as one source put it, was often noted. The clocks on City Hall, the bells of Trinity Church, and the regulators of the 4 leading jewelers all showed different times. And we see this yet again here in this newspaper clipping from the 1890s, pointing out the differences between 3 large public clocks in the 1890s. Now imagine one newspaper article asked a New Yorker following City Hall time, trying to do business with a friend regulated by the jeweler Hammond, or with a cashier with a Benedict in his pocket. A Benedict was a watch regulated by another jeweler, or with a notary carrying a Tiffany. Here, uncertainty was frankly acknowledged and blamed upon the multiplicity of time standards. The possibility that the New Yorker and his friends might have watches that ran fast or slow, or not at all, was not entertained. The fact was that even the finest timekeeping mechanism needed the attention of skilled repairmen and of skilled jewelers who would regularly regulate these watches. Skilled repairmen were actually hard to find. The ditty in this comic Valentine concluded, "A crowbar or pickaxe, a more fitting tool, would be in your hands, you ridiculous fool." So it was pointing out the dangers that a person would enter into when entrusting a jeweler with his shelf clock or pocket watch. Now, there were many timekeepers that never had a chance of running well at all, as illustrated by this 1868 cartoon lampooning the beguiled countryman who had bought a wooden watch. All these people buying, repairing, and carrying watches wished for certainty. They wished to join networks of other timekeeping individuals, of other clock watchers. Indeed, the demand for watches increased with each decade after the 1850s, despite the ongoing and well-known difficulties associated with regulating and synchronizing them. It would be as if we all continued to buy cell phones without a reliable cell phone network. And this is exactly how the situation stood through the 19th century in the US. Now, in the US, in most American cities at mid-century, railroad and local times were different. In some cases, dual-handed clocks showed local and railroad times. In other cases, the clock was engraved railroad time or city time. But in most cases, it was up to the clock watcher to figure out what time standard the clock ostensibly showed, if it was running correctly in the first place. The effort was puzzling at best, maddening at worst. All sorts of devices were fashioned to quell uncertainty, including tables and charts like these two from 1857 and 1862. The school teacher Charles Dowd's 1870s tables showed the difference between railroad time and local time for 800 different railroad stations. He was determined to ameliorate the confusion caused by what he called, quote, the bewildering diversity of clocks in the same depot. And what Dowd was pointing to was that in any given railroad depot, there might have been several different clocks associated with the different railroad lines that ran into the depot, and those clocks would have shown the time of that railroad line, not of the actual location. The tinkerer John Bell described the tired traveler wishing to catch a train. Bell writes, he goes groping about with a watch and a timetable in his pocket, which, though both are perfectly accurate, are at times almost useless to him. The traveler's watch, a source of security and satisfaction at home, when but a few miles away, becomes a tormenting puzzle. To resolve this problem, Bell fashioned an extra set of watch hands so that a watch could show 2 times at once, eliminating all uncertainty, or so he hoped. And here you see his patent, which he filed in 1882. The young Henry Ford, who held an abiding interest in watchmaking, was also fascinated by dual time standards. In 1883, he put together a watch with 2 dials. I don't believe he had access to Bell's patent. And he put together this watch with 2 dials, one that showed local time and the other that showed railroad time. A lot of energy and effort was put toward innovating a system that could accommodate multiple time standards. But with so many different local times, with so many different clocks, and with so many different railroad lines, there were just too many moving parts. Dowd, Bell, and others who built dual-face clocks or published elaborate timetables show us a path to nowhere. Yes, but it was a modern path. Their solutions insisted upon a sort of clock watching that required a double consciousness, a consciousness of time here and of time there, of this sort of time and of that sort of time. This sort of uncertainty, this sort of a multiplicity fostered a modern sensibility. But in the history of timekeeping, it wasn't Dowd's and Bell's modern sensibility that would take the day. Instead, William F. Allen, an editor and railroad official whose responsibilities included publishing and coordinating railroad schedules nationwide, he decided that the best and the only way out of the muck of multiple times was to abolish local time altogether. And I show you here a few of the instruments that were used to determine local time. Local time would be the time as determined by the sun. And so every place, so Princeton has a different local time than New York, than Philadelphia, because the longitude, the place on the earth is slightly different in those 3 places. So the instruments that would be used would be a sundial, which would show the apparent time, and then an equation of time, or here you see a table of the equation of days, which would show the mean time of the sun, so the mean time of the sun over the course of the year. So at any given time, except for a few days of the year, the sundial would show a time that was slightly slower or faster than the true time. And then you have here another kind of equation of time that I took from a sundial in New Zealand. So you could look at that sundial and then add or subtract minutes from the time that it showed. Now, William F. Allen, was not a fan of local time at all. He called it a snare and a delusion, And he thought it was such because he felt that most Americans couldn't ascertain the true time. And honestly, I think he might be right. These instruments look a little complicated to me when we get right down to it. And on those cloudy days, I'm not quite sure how we would have told the time at all. And so Allen estimated, and these are his words from a private letter he had written, he estimated, quote, there are probably not over a dozen cities in the United States that have any means of finding out what their true local time really is. Allen, dismayed by the constant work involved in coordinating the schedules of hundreds of railroads following different time standards, and irritated by the incessant demands to consider local times as well, Allen set up a standard time plan suitable for a territory as large as the United States. And this is the plan that we live with today. So he divided the nation into 5 zones in which the meridian time of the 60th, 75th, 90th, 105th, and 115th longitudes would be the standard. While multiple times would persist across the nation rather than within a single locality. So while these multiple times would persist, the elegance and the simplicity of the design would streamline operations and calculations. As Allen's plans for a national system of standard time coalesced, he expressed frustration with the schemes to simplify the translation of this new time into a town's true time. Wearing his editor's hat, he was editor of the official railway guide, Allen asked in the September 1883 issue, can anyone tell us precisely what local time is really? And a litany of examples of the loose timekeeping habits of most American communities followed. Arrogantly, Allen predicted in a letter that, quote, if the watches and clocks were changed without the people knowing it, not 1 out of 10,000 would find it out for himself. Scientific organizations, especially those whose practice required time-stamped observations, such as meteorology and astronomy, they urged Allen on in his work, as did the heads of the many different railroads. There was resistance in various pockets, and that's for another talk. So on the day of 2 noons, which was Sunday, November 18th, 1883, Allen with his family stood on the rooftop of Trinity Church, and they heard the bells of New York's St. Paul's Church strike the old time. And then they watched the Western Union time ball drop as it heralded the debut of a national standard, that is the new time zone time. And then Allen rejoiced as Trinity Church's bells announced the new time. So here on this rooftop in one episode, Allen heard actually 3 different times, heard and saw. Now this seeming fait accompli wasn't. It really was at least a decade after 1883, if not longer, before local time was abolished. Many communities tried to keep it. For example, as late as 1890, Detroit still refused to adopt standard time. But even when and where standard time was adopted, temporal uncertainty did not disappear. Watches and clocks, after all, were delicate machines, as one period repair manual put it. What is more, the conveyance of the time was elusive. Telegraphic lines faltered. Pneumatic systems meant to move the hands of the largest clocks, such as those on the city halls of Philadelphia and Milwaukee, these pneumatic systems often disappointed expectations, and wires and cables that were meant to connect clocks to a single time circuit continually baffled workmen, as one report put it in 1889. Another report issued by the U.S. Naval Observatory in 1887, I think, is instructive. This report was about the line that connected the Naval Observatory's master clock to 282 clocks in government buildings inside and outside of the Capitol. So these 282 clocks were all connected to the Naval Observatory's master clock by a series of cables and wires. But the report tells us there have been numerous breaks in the line owing to storms, lightning, and other accidental disturbances. On 3 days, none of the clocks were corrected, and on 6 other days, only a few of them were corrected. So this wasn't simply a case of typically bad government contract work. Cities across the nation and institutions across the nation were plagued by faulty timekeeping systems as well. Lack of agreement between clocks may have hindered synchronicity among individuals and institutions, and no doubt many meals and trains were missed or delayed before and after National Standard Time was implemented. In some instances, however, temporal uncertainty created rather than foreclosed possibilities. At mid-century, clocks and clock time only loosely governed the operation of Congress or of the Supreme Court. Through the middle decades of the century, Senate custom had an attendant turn the hands of its clock back whenever necessary. So here we see a solution to the looming debt crisis. They can just keep turning the clock back until they're able to pass the appropriations bill. Now, in this instance, in the mid 19th century, moving the hands of the clock back might have allowed the Senate to approve an appropriations bill in a timely manner or to avoid going into extra sessions. Senate employee Isaac Bassett, who had charge of this duty, described the practice in 1895, near the end of his 62 years of service, which had begun in 1833. Bassett recalled, "In olden times, when I turned the hands of the clock back, the senators all understood. The senators, that is, understood that time was mutable, that time served men and institutions. Time, clock time, was a social and a cultural convenience and a convention. So what did it matter if the Senate tampered with the hands of its clock so as to show whatever time it pleased? No single standard was in effect anyway, and even where agreed upon time standards were in effect, clocks ran fast, they ran slow, or they didn't run at all." In the early 1880s, the Senate's unusual timekeeping practice came under scrutiny, but even then the assumption persisted that clock time was malleable. As Bassett recounted about the 1880s, on one occasion, when I was through turning the hands back, Senator Benjamin Harvey Hill of Georgia arose in his seat and called the attention of the Senate to the fact and declared that it was all wrong. Bassett continues his story, however, explaining that Senator Hill's outburst was winked at by the other senators. The commotion created a great laugh all over the Senate chamber. Senator Hill clearly did not understand the rules of governance, though he may have understood the rules of timekeeping. Had he not died in office in 1882, Senator Hill might have had the last laugh about the clock, since the rules of timekeeping were about to change. Congress's conviction that it could do with clocks what it wished may have fallen dormant for a few decades, but in the midst of the First World War, it revived and reasserted that right. It did so when it implemented daylight saving time as a wartime measure meant to save energy. And this same piece of legislation, Congress made standard time national law. Here we see 3 senators, William Calder of New York, William Salisbury Jr. of Delaware, and Joseph Robinson of Arkansas, posing as a Senate sergeant at arms turned the clock forward. And one of them looks to be possibly regulating his own watch. Uncertainty persisted, though in far smaller degrees than what had characterized the 19th century. In the 1920s, wireless transmission of time signals and innovations in clock design and in electric power distribution together resulted in the elimination of most temporal uncertainty. So here we see a somebody regulating a clock using the radio. So electric clocks were a very important improvement in terms of eliminating the kind of uncertainty that clocks seem to foster. Electric clocks, unlike the tall case clocks in the exhibit at the Morven, electric clocks didn't need weights or springs to control their rate, but instead they depended on the motion of alternating current to meet out the time. So at this point, when electric clocks are introduced, numerous companies offered time systems to managers of large offices and institutions like schools, and they marketed electrically wound clocks, often called self-winding, to householders. But until the electric power supply was reliable and the design of clocks moved away from 3 centuries worth of investment in weight-driven and spring-driven movements, electricity was mostly called upon to synchronize or to wind clocks. So despite electricity's transformation of timekeeping, clock winders still visited thousands of households and hundreds of public clocks every week in all the major American cities well through the 1940s. Now, in conclusion, I'd like to return to this concept of clock watching, and hopefully not because you're watching the clock. But let me conclude here with this slide. Clock watching, as we have seen, highlighted apprehension of power, of disorder, and of decay. Here we see 2 people intently looking at their watches. Charles M. Walton, a lieutenant in the Union Army, presented this carte de visite to the future Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in the midst of war in 1863. The photograph draws attention to the open watch, whose face we cannot see. Though time is momentarily arrested in photographic image and watch dial, it cannot be stopped. Nor can we predict the events that fill its blanks. Will death or victory or both be the outcome? A man in uniform looking at a watch draws our attention to the uncertainty of time. The Waltham Watch Company's lush advertising poster from 1900 also draws attention to other kinds of clock watching. Here, the dial is visible, but the admonition that you see is that time and tide wait for no man, again begets uncertainty. What will time and tide bring? A sense of urgency is conveyed. A pall of uncertainty falls over the scene. What can be done? As the poster subtly urges, buy more time, seek more certainty, buy a Waltham watch. And that is exactly what Americans did. Their patronage enriched watch and clock manufacturers and retailers, and they underwrote with tax dollars, with donations, and with outright gifts the construction of tens of thousands of public clocks, many so enormous they were called monster clocks. Clock watching was not simply about seeking accuracy and precision so as to achieve high degrees of speed and efficiency, though that too happened. It was also about exploring, marveling at, and quelling uncertainty. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor McCrossen. That was fascinating. And, I just kept thinking throughout the presentation how much I take time today for granted. So just for our audience, if you don't mind putting your questions, any questions you may have in the Q&A box, we can switch over and address some of those now. So I had a question. I was thinking about work and the workday, especially when you were talking about Congress and kind of how the timing of sessions could be really adjusted based on what was going on. And I was wondering if you could speak to how the workday developed. As you may have approached in your research through these different concepts of time as we head through the 19th century.
Oh, what a great question. Well, of course, the workday for centuries was really determined by natural time, right? By the rising of the sun and the setting of the sun, and another factors that might have interfered with natural time. So when people are working in fields, right, they're working on a kind of natural clock, and depending on how much work there is to do in the fields, one might get up even before the actual sunrise, right at dawn, and finish after the sunset when there's that last bit of light with dusk. So that there's that kind of work day. Now, when clocks are introduced, they're actually used in agricultural labor as well, as a way to obtain more efficiency, to try to eke out a little bit more time, right? So they're used in all sorts of different ways in agriculture, but in terms of industry, in terms of factories, in terms of offices, the workday also at first is set to the natural day, and depending on the degree of privilege that a person might have had, a banker, right, kept banker's hours, and those were fairly short. A banker's day did not begin at sun up or end at sundown. And then clocks increasingly are introduced. So at Lowell Mills, which are some of the first factories in the US, they tried to discipline the workforce with a clock and a bell that would call them to work and release them from work. And then increasingly, laborers are expected to show up to work without the call of time. That is, to know that they need to be there at 7:30 or at 8 or whatever time the workday began. Now, since workdays tended to be 10 to 12 hours, if not more, the clock kept quite a bit of, it was a very, very long day. It's not entirely clear exactly when hourly wages began to be paid. Even in factory situations, people tended to be paid more by the day or by the piece, or by the half day, or sometimes by the week. And increasingly, though, by the end of the 19th century, you have time clocks. And this is beginning to organize labor, both white collar and blue collar labor, in different kinds of ways.
Great, thank you. How did the local time and railroad time, as we're moving into the kind of latter part of the 19th century, how did that develop within the context of the world internationally? You know, when we're thinking about communicating with, across the Atlantic and other
Right.
parts of the world.
Okay, so Greenwich established itself as the sort of keeper and maker of world time, and largely this was, and so today, right, we talk about the Greenwich meridian is zero longitude. That's sort of where the world begins, and largely the British were able to assert that privilege because they were the ones who published the nautical charts that were most widely used. And those nautical charts were included the meridian and the longitude and equations of time, and those were used for navigation. The French tried to compete with the British for sovereignty over world time by suggesting that the Paris Observatory was more accurate than the Greenwich Observatory, and they published their own nautical charts using Paris as the baseline. They tried to sort this out in 1884 in a international conference over time standards. It isn't really fully sorted out until the period of World War I, when by default most of the different parts of the world follow suit at different times, but by default the Greenwich becomes the prime meridian. So in 1903, wireless communications develop, and the Atlantic and the Pacific cables have been laid by that time. So there is more of a sense of synchronicity around the world, although it's a synchronicity that's really only shared by officials and in print. unlike today where presumably somebody could be on the Zoom call in Australia, where we have this technologies that actually create simultaneity and a much more lived experience of it, I guess is a good way of putting it, right? If we're even we are on different time zones, right? But we're in the simultaneous moment together here. So that's a good start. There's there's some pretty good recent works on timekeeping around the world, which I'd be happy to point somebody to if they wish. Feel free to email me.
Yeah, thank you. Another question here. How did you become interested in the kind of cultural history of time?
Oh, well, thank you. That's such a nice question. I've always been interested in why people decide to do things at particular times, and I've always been interested in the tension between living by the clock and living by the experience. So time, a kind of transcending time, becoming so absorbed that one loses track of time, and yet how time can both become a kind of prison and a cage, but also time, by keeping time, by being careful with our time, by marshaling our time, we're able to do so much more. We're able to see so many more people, or go so many more places, or get so many more things done in a given day. So that fascination informed my thinking when I was in graduate school, and I found Sunday, the day of the week, as a very good place to think about timekeeping, about attitudes and ideas related to timekeeping and related to Sunday. So legal laws about Sunday, theology about Sunday, and ideas, values, and beliefs associated with Sunday, and how that came up against all of the different ways of living that Americans were beginning to experience in the 19th century. So I worked on that, and while I was working on it, I found this photograph actually of a tall case clock with a naked little toddler climbing out of it. And I was so fascinated by that. I couldn't figure out for the life of me what that was all about. And that got me into studying clocks and watches themselves. And just coincidentally, when I did figure out what that image was, it was an image celebrating the new year. So the toddler was symbolizing the new year, a fresh start, right? Fresh time. And we see that imagery everywhere. And so that actually got me to my third book as well.
That's so interesting. And that was another question for me that came up as I was looking at all the beautiful and fascinating images that you have in your presentation. Are there, as a historian, are there certain archives or libraries, places that you go to that are full of information about, this topic?
Oh gosh, no, unfortunately. Well, fortunately and unfortunately. I mean, William F. Allen, our standard time guy who looked down his nose at local time, he has a very nice set of papers, or there is a nice set of papers of his at the New York Public Library. Apart from that, the archives are really scattered, so it depends on what you're looking for. So some of the U.S. Naval Observatory papers are in DC in the National Archives. I use the Library of Congress an awful lot. You just have to dig around. In my book, I use the repair, it was called a watch book of a watch repairman. He recorded 2,000 watches that he had repaired, and he included their serial numbers and how they broke, and this became a great source of information. The Smithsonian Institution has the collections of two of the biggest public clock manufacturers, E. Howard and Seth Thomas, and they have almost all of their business records. The Waltham watch papers are at the Harvard Business School. So, there are all sorts of places to dig around. And then, short stories, right?
Mhm.
Fiction, photographs. There's just an endless amount of material one can work with.
That's wonderful. It's such an eclectic mix of things to really broaden and tell the story. So I think we have time for one more of our questions here. So this is touching on today. So there, and I don't know the exact wording or legislation that the question's referring to, but there is active legislation going through right now to actually end daylight savings time.
Right.
And I guess this is a two-part question. So kind of what do you think about that? But also, how do you see that in this greater timeline of how Americans are interacting with time as that progresses to the present day?
Well, first of all, this piece of legislation is in the Congress or the Senate. I can't remember which house. And I think it's one of the only examples of bipartisanship from the last couple of years. So I'll applaud it for that alone. Um, I'm not sure about abolishing daylight savings time. I mean, maybe we don't need it anymore because we are less oriented to early mornings than we used to be. I've noticed that many people's work days don't begin till 9 or 10. And here at SMU, you'll never see a student, or very rarely see a student in a class before 9:30. And even 9:30 seems a bit early for them. So in that sense, those early morning hours when light used to be really valued, right? At 7 o'clock, getting up, kids are going to school. It's safer to wait for a bus or to drive and when it's light out. But since I mean, I'm not entirely sure. I don't know the statistics about who goes to work at what time. Maybe we don't need it. I think, in my opinion, the jury might be out on that because it really does create more safety, at least when everybody's following a day that starts at 6:30 or 7. How do I see daylight saving in terms of, I mean, in some ways, I think that we're becoming, I mean, we're very, very clock oriented. Everybody knows what time it is all the time, even though none of my students wear watches and none of the classrooms at SMU have a clock in it. And yet everybody seems to know exactly what time it is all the time. And that's, I think, because of the cell phones. So, I mean, in terms of how people manipulate time, I think there's less of an awareness that time is actually mutable and that we could declare right now, all of us here together, I guess it looks like there are 11 of us, we could say it's 8:32, or as I sometimes will say, you know, when it's 4 in the afternoon, I'll say it's 5, time for a drink, right? We can declare it to be whatever time we want it to be, but if no one else agrees with us, we won't get very far.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Professor McCrossen, for this presentation. Again, you know, as you just said, I think I'm realizing how much I take how we watch time today for
Mhm.
granted. And you've also placed our exhibition and the clocks that we're featuring within this you know, this larger context, which is so helpful of, you know, people were not um, interacting with time necessarily the same way in the period, and what did that look like? So this was really fantastic, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us and to share this presentation.
Oh, well, thank you. It was my pleasure. Appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, well, everyone have a wonderful evening and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.